Hello, YouTube, and welcome to Level-Headed News. This is your host, Brenda. I have 5 articles for you in this episode, and the URLs are listed in the description of this video for you, in case you want to do some research on them. I'm waiting to make sure that our volume is working, our audio is up. Bear with me. There we go. Okay, everything seems to be working properly. The first article I have for you is off of IdahoStatesman.com, and it says, Idaho founder arrested after process server says he threatened her with a gun. And for any of you that followed the Oregon standoff issue, you've heard this name before. Brandon Curtis, after he failed to turn over rents and other payments on properties he managed for clients, was arrested last month in Payette County after confrontation with a woman serving him papers for an Ada County lawsuit. Brandon Curtis was one of the fellas that was out there in Oregon, was a major player. Here, the incident happened August the 9th, and I don't know why it's taken so long for this to... Here, I've got it now. It's 9th when the process server for Tri-County Process Serving of Boise went to a Fruitland home rented by Curtis in the 400 block of Northwest 9th Street. The woman said she knocked on the front door. Moments later, Curtis came from around the back side of the house and confronted her. "Get the expletive off my property. I have a gun and I'm going to use it," the woman said Curtis told her, according to the incident report filed by Officer Brian Wallace of the Fruitland Police Department. And she goes on to say that he said, "I'm going to expletive shoot you if you don't get off my expletive property." Curtis, who was about 25 feet from the woman, had his right hand on the butt of his handgun with a snap of the holster undone, she said. As Curtis was yelling at her, he pulled the gun partially out of the holster, she told police. Telling Curtis she would leave, the woman left the papers concerning a lawsuit filed in Ada County by Woodside Properties on his porch. Her vehicle, Curtis approached and tried to hand her back the papers. He ended up shoving them under the windshield wiper. The woman turned on the wipers and the papers fell on the ground as she pulled away. "For my life," the woman told police after driving to the Fruitland Police Department. She spoke to Wallace, who said she was crying. "While I was speaking with the victim, I could visibly see she was upset. Her speech was rapid, shaking, cracking. Her hands were shaking, and she appeared to be distraught," Wallace wrote in his report released to the Statesman on Thursday following a public records request to the Payette County Court. Fruitland Police Chief J.D. Huff later spoke to Curtis, age 43, who said he had no trespassing signs posted on his property and that the woman illegally trespassed. Talking with his child when he saw a woman peeking through the front window, Huff wrote in a supplemental report. He became very angry and went around the back of the house to confront the woman, Huff wrote. Profanities at the woman and demanded that she identify herself. He said the woman dropped the papers on the doorstep and retreated to her vehicle. He admitted telling the woman he was armed and was going to use it if she didn't get off his property, Huff wrote. Curtis said the woman spun her tires as she drove away, spraying him with rocks. Curtis was charged January the 9th with aggravated assault. January the 23rd. He's scheduled to return to court March the 6th for a preliminary hearing before Magistrate Brian Lee. In the Ada County case, Properties, the company won a default judgment of $5,219 on January the 12th against Curtis and his dissolved companies, Management and Liberty Property Management. Curtis came under public scrutiny after he portrayed himself as a successful manager in a story that appeared in the Oregonian during the last year's standoff at the Malheur Wildlife Refuge. Curtis, founder and president of 3 Percenters of Idaho, of armed men who set up a security perimeter near the refuge. After that story ran, business clients of Curtis's contacted Idaho statesmen to say Curtis failed to deposit rent money he had collected. Curtis filed for bankruptcy, listing assets of $13,230 and debts of $235,000. The Idaho State Police have been investigating Curtis after at least 17 property owners who say he owes them money with the agency and the Idaho Attorney General's office. Then last September, former members of the Three Percenters of Idaho and Curtis of improperly spending money from its bank and PayPal accounts. Curtis denies the charges and said an audit report would be issued exonerating him. That same month, Liberty Property Management was fined $7,200 after failing to carry workers' compensation insurance for its employees. So it seems to me that Mr. Curtis is a little shady. I thought that was very, very interesting. The next article that I have for you is off of Oregon, or there we go. I want to call it the Oregonian. It's not. It's Oregon Live. It says after Malheur, Democrat allows debate on Oregon control of federal lands. Bill 2365 is what's known as a message bill, a legislative way for lawmakers to take a stand, even though their proposal won't pass. It's walking dead. The bill would establish a task force to study transferring most of Oregon's federal land to state control. Columbia River. It looks like there's something trying to play here. And let's see if we can get that shut off. See?
It's just because of the point. That's why you're my favorite.
Louise. Doggone ads. Oh, now we don't want to hear whatever you're peddling. Finally found the off button on that. Wasn't where it's supposed to be. All right. Now let's get things to settle down here. The bill would establish a task force to study transferring most of Oregon's federal land to state control. Places like the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area and the Mount Hood National Forest would be being owned by state already on the brink of selling public land. But there it was Thursday morning in Salem being discussed in Hearing Room D of the Oregon Capitol after Representative Brian Clem, a Salem Democrat who chairs the Agricultural Committee, called a public hearing. What surprised conservation groups who came to speak in opposition was not the idea, similar bills have been introduced in the state legislature across the West. It was that a Democrat granted the public forum as a fringe far-right idea promoted by Ammon Bundy and his family. The Bundys led the occupation of the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in 2016. The legislature would consider HB 2365 to us as deeply troubling. Sean Stevens, the executive director of Oregon Wild, told lawmakers, "We're just a year removed from the armed occupation of the Malheur Refuge. The Bundys preached a warped view of America's public land. HB 2365 appears to embrace the idea of the Bundys." In the West, where the federal government is the majority landowner, public lands have the right for decades. But the fight over the fate took on a new life after the Malheur occupation, with the Republican Party including the conveyance of federal land to local control its national platform. A Utah Republican Congressman, Jason Chavez, and remember that name, you're going to hear it again here soon, recently withdrew a bill targeting the lands in Oregon and elsewhere amidst the, and elsewhere in the West, cry from hunters and anglers. The Trump administration, meanwhile, has signaled that it is not interested in privatizing public lands. Representative Carl Wilson Josephine County Republican who sponsored HB 2365 told lawmakers Thursday that the federal forests in his district are poorly managed, fire-prone, and beset by litigation. He said he thought Oregon state agencies could exercise a much more loving, caring oversight. We would make the decision in Salem rather than Washington, D.C., he said. I just have to believe we would do a better job. Transferring federal timberland to state control would subject it to logging laws that are less environmentally protective than federal rules, which prohibits practices like aerial spraying of herbicides and on clear cuts. Oregon's aerial spray laws are the weakest on the West Coast. Only wanted on how Oregon could steward federal land if the legal hurdles were cleared, something scholars say there's no chance of happening. I think it would be fun just to find out what it would be like, Wilson said. Michael Bloom, a Lewis and Clark Law School professor who studies public lands and did not attend the hearing, said the state has no legal authority to demand the federal government hand over its land. The task force would be a whole lot better off studying things like why federal public lands produce better water quality and species protection than state lands do, Bloom said. Decision to hold a hearing on the idea was curious. It does seem surprising to me that he would do this because it does seem, or try this again, because it does fan the flames, Bloom said. The protests Thursday morning from conservation groups did not go unnoticed by Democratic lawmakers who criticized the advocates for criticizing them, said Representative Susan McLean, a Hillsborough Democrat. I don't like the way some people were, in my mind, impinging the idea that we would even listen to a colleague. Stevens said in a later interview that he worried the hearing helped legitimize the Malheur occupiers' anti-government philosophy. Lawmakers should be considering resolutions endorsing the values of federal public lands, he said, not debating their divestment. There are thousands of bills introduced every year. Brian Clem has a choice of what he wants to hear, Stevens said. This is providing some imprimatur of authority to ideas that should be an extreme box. Clem acknowledged the hearing was poorly timed. He should have waited a month, he said, or done it a week earlier. Instead, it was held 2 days after another Oregon Democrat, State Treasurer Tobias Reed, voted to support the privatization of the Elliott State Forest, an 82,500-acre parcel in the Coast Range northeast of Coos Bay. The state is constitutionally obligated to manage the Elliott benefit schools and timberland. From the land has dropped after environmental lawsuits. That doesn't read correctly. I think they've left a word or two out of there. It says, but when Reed rejected Governor Kate Brown's proposal for retaining public ownership on Tuesday, it drew an immediate rebuke from the environmental groups who said he had betrayed their support. Clem said he was staunchly opposed to the Bundys' philosophy, calling them whack jobs that needed to be arrested. He said there was no chance that he'd move HB 2365 out of committee. Federal land, he said, is if it's ever put for sale, like the private-owned Klamath Falls property that became the Gilchrist State Forest. Clem said he held the hearing because his committee this early in the legislative session. A recent meeting adjourned 45 minutes early, he said, because lawmakers ran out of bills to discuss. Until we have a problem, I'm not rotating anybody, he said. To be anti-public hearing because it may legitimize something is a horrible policy for us to consider, Clem said. That's just anti-democratic. It sounds very Trump-like, honestly. Well, called the Bundys whack jobs. What does the Constitution say? And did you take an oath to uphold the Constitution when you were voted into office? And why are you not upholding the Constitution? And since you're not upholding the Constitution, is that not treasonous? And why are the people of your state not holding you accountable for treason. The next article that I have for you of gemstatepatriot.com. And this one says, 4 BLM-related suicides after over-the-top interrogations. Representative Jason Chavez to act. Told you to remember that name. Following a forced suicide subsequent to bullying and harassment by Bureau of Land Management law enforcement agents, I, Christopher Corklander, the founding director of the Custer Battlefield Museum in Gary Owen, Montana, am speaking out. I myself, the victim of 2 unwarranted BLM raids, say the intimidation and threats by teams of heavily armed BLM law enforcement agents must end. The Bureau of Land Management has a long track record of aggressive harassment, unwarranted raids, and heartbreaking suicides to answer for. Their questionable assertions of criminal behavior and unchecked aggression and those involved must be investigated. Representative Jason Chavez, a Republican from Utah, said, "We need to be more Andy Griffith and less Rambo." In January 24th press release, he announced his plan to do just that. Chavez reintroduced the Local Enforcement for Local Land Act, or H.R. 622, which will strip the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service of their law enforcement authority, with the aim of bringing these agencies into line. It's time to get rid of the BLM and the U.S. Forest Service police, Chavez says. If there is a problem, your local sheriff is the first and best line of defense. By restoring local control in law enforcement, we enable federal agencies and county sheriffs to each focus on their respective core missions. In 2014, I was asked by an elected official to submit written testimony to the House of Representatives subcommittee that investigates this type of harassment and intimidation by federal law enforcement, but nothing has come of it. It's time to get the public involved to end this kind of harassment of private law-abiding citizens. And it has an insert here. It says, see congressional hearing, threats, intimidation, and bullying by federal land management agencies. The attached 56-page document, if you click that link, submitted at this congressional hearing on July the 24th, 2014 at 2 p.m. in room 1324 of the Longworth House office building. It's very important because it reveals why the Custer Battlefield Museum raids, the Four Corners raids, and the Gibson guitar raids occurred. Raids lead to suicides. On June the 9th of 2009, 17 teams of fully armed Bureau of Land Management agents raided the southeastern Utah homes of 24 casual Indian artifact hobbyist collectors. When the over-the-top militaristic raids concluded, 24 people were charged with felonies and misdemeanors under the 1979 Archaeological Resource Protection Act, or the ARPA, which prohibits removing archaeological resources, including Native American artifacts, from tribal or federal lands. The day after the access raids, following hours of aggressive interrogation by the BLM agents, spearheaded by Dan Love, Dr. James Redd, one of those charged under the ARPA law, committed suicide. A week later, Stephen Schrader, another man charged in connection with the Four Corners raids, killed himself. 8 months later, Ted Garnier, the man the BLM agents had paid $224,000 to supply them with unverified information about Indian artifacts hobbyist collectors, also killed himself. The most recent BLM-related suicide on December the 1st of 2016, after months of harassment and bullying by the federal law enforcement, half a dozen Bureau of Land Management and U.S. Forest Service agents, accompanied by a federal Social Security investigator, raided the Cody, Wyoming home of Robert Weaver, collected fossils. Weaver underwent 8 brutal interrogation and bullying by the BLM agents and the Social Security investigator. Following his release, no charges were ever filed. Federal agents continued to interrogate, harass, and intimidate Weaver for an entire month. On December 31st, 2016, Robert Weaver took his own life. Tragically, became the fourth suicide in connection with the over-the-top BLM raid. While talking to Representative Chavez' press secretary today, I was surprised to learn that they had not heard of the most recent suicide brought on by the BLM. Also today, Representative Chavez had a private meeting with President Trump regarding the reform priorities of the GOP agenda. When Bob Weaver took his own life, it became the fourth suicide related to BLM raid. One would think that this should be a catalyst to make Representative Chavez efforts to pass H.R. 622 bill to demilitarize the BLM law enforcement division successful. Raids at Gary Owen. In 2005 and again in 2008, I was a victim of a similar Nazi Gestapo-like raid by overzealous, unprofessional BLM law enforcement agents intent on proving that I was involved in the illegal trafficking of artifacts. Following the 2005 raid, no proof of wrongdoing was found and no charges were filed. The 2008 raid resulted in the same outcome, but the damage had been done. My historical rarities collection business was left in shambles, and my good reputation as an upstanding member of the antiquities field was tarnished. The fight to restore my life and livelihood has left me exhausted, frustrated, and disheartened. The recent news of yet another suicide of someone connected to raids by the BLM has steeled my resolve to end this federal law enforcement nightmare. I'm not willing to let another day go by without bringing the BLM outrageous actions and unprofessional behavior to the attention of the American people, the Department of the Interior's office, and the Inspector General and the Department of Justice. The law enforcement unit of the BLM may be able to live with being connected to the suicides of law-abiding citizens, but I cannot, and neither should any other American. The Bureau of Land Management and other Department of the Interior law enforcement agencies have developed a Rambo-type attitude, and they've been running amok, threatening and raiding innocent private citizens and respected businesses like Gibson Guitars and Custer Battlefield Museum with impunity. No one is stopping them, and our elected officials cannot sit on the sidelines any longer. A single suicide in connection to the Bureau of Land Management raid should alone be enough to warrant an investigation into the especially aggressive tactics used by the BLM. Federal agencies law enforcement division is now linked to 4 suicides, all of which could have possibly been prevented had it not been for the threats, intimidation, and bullying at the hands of the Department of the Interior's law enforcement agents. I am working on a book that documents my personal experience with abuse and aggression at the hands of the BLM law enforcement division. Release date is late 2017. Furthermore, I have contacted each member of the Montana congressional delegation asking them to rein in the terrorist tactics of the BLM. I have also contacted Representative Jason Chavez, Republican of Utah, who reintroduced his bill in Congress on January the 24th of 2017. We, the people of the United States, must contact our congressional delegation. Find your representative. There's a link that you can click in this to find your representative and urge them to co-sponsor Representative Chavez's bill, H.R. 622, to demilitarize the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service. And you can read more about the bill. There's a link that you can click in this article to read more about that bill and educate yourself on this. And it's important that you do that. The next article that I have is off of KSL.com, and it says Chavez. I told you, remember that name. Going to be popular here. Chavez calls for wider probe of BLM agent, Salt Lake City. Representative Jason Chavez, Republican of Utah, has called for a wider probe of a federal Bureau of Land Management agent who played a key role in the standoff with Nevada rancher Cliven Bundy before coming under investigation for his activities at Burning Man. Chavez, chairman of the House Oversight Committee, said in a letter that the allegations against the Salt Lake City BLM supervisor, Daniel Love, could undermine trust in the agency and should be probed by the Department of Interior inspectors. The department's Office of Inspector General did not immediately respond to a request for comment on the letter released on Friday. Chavez pointed to reports that Love asked employees to scrub emails before responding to a congressional records request and delete documents from a shared server. He was also accused of coaching an employee on what to say before an interview with government investigators. The Office of Inspector General has previously faulted the supervisory agent from Salt Lake City for accepting sold-out Burning Man tickets and having agents drive around his family during the Nevada event in 2015. The investigator also found evidence he manipulated a hiring process so a friend could get a job at the BLM. The report released January 30th was referred to higher-ups for possible disciplinary action. The BLM didn't immediately return a call seeking comment on Chavez's letter dated February the 14th. Messages left at publicly listed phone numbers for Love were also not immediately returned. And there is a tweet here that Jason Chavez put out saying, letter to Inspector General about BLM and their findings regarding Employee Oversight House. Then we have the article continue. It says, Love, who oversaw the Bundy's cattle roundup in 2014, is expected to be an important witness for the prosecution during a trial unfolding in Las Vegas for 6 men accused of illegally wielding weapons during the standoff. Defense attorney pushing for the case to be dismissed say they should have previously been informed about the allegations against Love. He was also the target of a federal lawsuit from the family of a Southern Utah doctor, James Redd, who killed himself after he was arrested in a 2009 artifact looting investigation that marked early skirmish in the struggle for control of public lands. Insert here where you can click to get a report on the BLM agents at Burning Man finding ethics violations to give you more information on that. And the article goes on. It says the family said BLM agents led by Love used excessive force when they arrested Redd at gunpoint. That case was dismissed by appeals court Monday after the judges found the presence of agents in SWAT-like gear wasn't unreasonable given the large volume of evidence and long-standing local opposition to federal control of public lands. Final article in this episode that I have for you is off of Conservative Tribune. It says driver rams through groups protesting Dakota Access Pipeline in Los Angeles. Protesters blocking a road in Los Angeles just discovered that in a battle between car and a liberal, the car does tend to win. Fox News, a driver in a white car drove through an ad hoc roadblock set up by a group of individuals protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline on Tuesday evening. KNBC TV reported that the protesters, which were organized by Gender Justice LA, National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Alliance, and the women's group Mesures de Maz, had blocked busy Wilshire Boulevard near the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers office in downtown Los Angeles. Aerial footage shows one motorist who tried to slowly go through the roadblock to get to his destination instead of going around it. The protesters gathered around him at one point, covering the windshield with their banner. Some also seemed almost to throw themselves on the car's hood. However, the car kept on slowly moving through the roadblock, taking one protester with it. And there's video here if you want to take a look at what they pulled. It says, now let's be clear, if you run into one of these protests and you can go around it, you probably should. However, this shows just how dangerous and stupid these road blocking protests are. This individual behind the wheel had nothing to do with the Dakota Access Pipeline. The driver was not responsible for planning it, constructing it, or anything similar, and yet this group of protesters decided to block a road and surround and intimidate him and motorists like him. Why? Why not? That seems to be the common thread of thought behind these protests. They're dangerous. They're accomplishing nothing, yet where were the police? Nowhere to be found. And it wasn't as if there was a whole lot of critical mass. As you can see from looking at it, this was a relatively small group. It's time for law enforcement to put an end to these protests before it's too late. And that's all I have for you in this episode. If you like what I'm doing here, give it a thumbs up. Share it on your social media. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done that yet, and that way you'll stay informed. See you in the next episode.